Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is an odd little film called The Killing of Satan. Now, The Killing of Satan is a 1983 Filipino horror fantasy film. Now, The Killing of Satan is a movie that I discovered actually a few months ago at a horror convention. There were these people selling all these movies that were basically just VHSs burned to DVDs, and this was one of the movies that they were selling. And admittedly, this was sort of a blind buy. Like, I just wanted to buy a couple of DVDs, and I thought the title looked interesting, and the cover was interesting, so I was like, I never heard of this film, but I'm gonna buy it. That DVD is mine now. And I have to say that this is an interesting film. An odd film, but an interesting film nonetheless. Now, The Killing of Satan is not a movie I can necessarily recommend for everybody. It's definitely a movie for a very specific type of audience. Like, it's very cheesy and it's really bizarre, but if you're into stuff like that, then I would definitely recommend this. Now, the plot of The Killing of Satan is, it begins where you follow this wizard named Miguel who lives in this village, and for a while now, the people of this village have been terrorized by a gang led by an evil wizard who calls himself the Prince of Magic. After a battle with the Prince of Magic, Miguel is wounded and is dying. The movie also starts following Miguel's nephew, Landau, who lives in another village. Now, Landau is an ex-con who is trying to put his life together, and he's trying to take care of his family, but what happens is a gang of criminals led by an old enemy of his come after him, and they end up killing his son, and they kill him, or so it seems. What happens is his Uncle Miguel uses his magic to transfer his life force into Landau, saving Landau's life but sacrificing his own. Now, the reason his Uncle Miguel did this is because Landau is actually the chosen one. Later on, Landau and his wife and daughter go to see his Uncle Miguel, not realizing yet that he died, and they find out that he died from a friend of his uncle's, and they also find out about the Prince of Magic and his gang, and what happens is Landau's daughter and his cousin end up getting kidnapped by the Prince of Magic, and Landau discovers that he has magical powers himself. And it turns out that the Prince of Magic and his gang have also been kidnapping women from the neighboring villages and are keeping them naked in a cage with these black bands around their necks, which keep them under some sort of mind control or hypnosis. So, armed with his newfound magical powers, Landau and this friend of his uncle's go to rescue his daughter and his cousin. But in the movie you eventually find out that the Prince of Magic works for Satan himself, and it turns out that Satan demands a bride, and now they're trying to make Landau's daughter the bride of the devil. Eventually Landau actually meets God himself, and God gives him this magical staff, which he can now use to battle the Prince of Magic, and then ultimately Satan. Now, The Killing of Satan is a very entertaining film. It is cheesy as hell, no pun intended, but it's still a very fun movie. Now, I know there are a lot of people who would probably find this film to be really bad. It depends on your mindset, really, because, once again, it's not a movie for everybody, but if you're a fan of, like, exploitation films, and if you're a fan of just really cheesy, out-there movies, then I cannot recommend this movie enough. And even the quote-unquote bad aspects of the movie, because there are definitely some flaws to this movie, even the flaws make it somehow more entertaining in my opinion. And admittedly, the movie does start out a little slow, but once it gets going, it really gets going, and it really does get kind of bonkers. Like, in Uncle Miguel's village, you get this idea that there are other wizards as well, and there's this really bizarre scene where one of the Prince of Magic's henchmen gets into a staring contest with this old man. There's also a dream sequence where Landau sees his uncle Miguel get flattened by a boulder, yet Miguel is still talking to him after the rest of his body has been flattened.
Lando!
The fight scenes between Landau and the Prince of Magic, and then the final fight between Landau and Satan is really out there.
I will fight you as a mortal.
But Landau is actually a pretty likable character and is actually kind of a sweet man, but he's also a badass. Like, there's one point in the movie where he actually bitch slaps a demonic snake and then ties it in a knot. Now, as cheesy as the killing of Satan is, there actually are some interesting themes in the movie about responsibility and family and what it means to be a man. And one thing I think is really interesting about the movie is a lot of the fantasy sequences of the film are very outlandish, but a lot of the non-supernatural sequences in the film are actually kind of gritty in the way that they're shot. It's interesting, there's almost like a conflicting style of tone between certain scenes because all the fantasy sequences in the film show that this is clearly not set in the real world. At the same time, though, some of the non-supernatural sequences in the movie are almost shot like pseudo-realistically. And as cheesy as a lot of this movie is, there are actually some scenes in the movie that are actually pretty atmospheric. And there are actually some interesting biblical allegories in this film. For example, the main character Landau, his full name is Landau Saint Miguel, which is supposed to sound like Saint Michael. And I don't know if this is what the filmmakers were going for, but I almost get this feeling that this staff that God gives Landau is supposed to be the same staff that Moses used to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. Also in the movie, there's this little mute boy who is actually supposed to be Jesus. Now, I might be reaching here, but I mentioned the kidnapped women who are kept in the cage. Eventually, Landau does save these women, and he lifts the Prince of Magic's control over them, and they suddenly realize that they're naked, and they try to cover up, and I don't know if that was supposed to be a reference to the Book of Genesis, where throughout that, Adam and Eve didn't realize that they were nude until they took a bite out of the forbidden fruit. I might be reaching way deeper than the director actually intended with that scene. But one scene in the movie that was definitely meant as an Adam and Eve reference is there's a certain point in the movie where the succubi try to tempt Landau and one of them has an apple. Yeah, real subtle. Now, once again, the movie is very cheesy. Like, a lot of the fight scenes in the movie are really cheesy, and a lot of the effects work is really cheesy. And even the devil himself is pretty cheesy in this movie. I mean, when you first see him, he's the stereotypical devil with the horns and red skin and pointed tail. He even has a pitchfork, for God's sake. But he does have another form in the movie where he basically looks like a horned Dracula. But the cheesiest thing about this movie really is the dub-in. Now, I've never seen this movie in its original language with the English subtitles, and maybe if I was watching the movie like that, I might be able to take some of it a little more seriously, but the dub-in in this movie is pretty freaking bad. At the same time, though, the bad dub-in kind of adds kind of a cheesy charm to the film. But I want to say the worst example of dub-in in this movie is there's a scene in the movie where the succubus is trying to fool Landau into thinking that she's an old woman, and the way it sounds is exactly what it is. A young woman doing a really bad impression of an old woman. Like, I remember when I was in elementary school, they would have, like, school plays, and they would have, like, a little girl playing an old woman, and she would do, like, a really bad old woman accent, and that's basically what the dub actress does here.
I lost my way, son. I took the wrong path to my place.
Where are you staying?
It's there. Down that lane.
I think I'd better take you to your place.
But yeah, The Killing of Satan is a really fun movie, and if you like cheesy exploitation films, I would definitely recommend this, and the movie has everything. It has zombies, demons, succubi, evil rapist wizards, and of course, the fallen angel himself, Lucifer. What more could you ask for out of a weird Filipino fantasy horror film? So yeah, that was my review on The Killing of Satan, and bye.